COVID-19 is now planet-wide, but it is hitting at different speeds and intensity depending on where you live. Never in our lifetimes has the world faced a challenge of this magnitude. The global impact of COVID-19 has accelerated dramatically. It has already claimed more than 34 lakhs 40,000 lives. The outbreak of pandemic COVID-19 has disturbed the political, social, economic, religious, and financial structures all over the world. Sun Tzu, a Chinese military strategist, in his book, The Art of War, emphasized that if you know your enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. Dear viewers, my guests for tonight are John Morrell, Regional Director for the Asia and Pacific at the Center for International Enterprise, CIPE. He is joining us from Washington, D.C. John, welcome to the show. We have also with us Dr. Parvez Imdad, an economist, governance specialist, and national and international civil servant. He is also joining us from D.C. Dr. Parvez, welcome to Tritiyo Matra.
Thank you.
John, let me start with you. Is COVID-19 a geopolitical game changer?
Yes. First, though, as a guest on your program and a guest in Bangladesh, allow me to extend my congratulations to you and all Bangladeshis on your 50th birthday, 1971 to 2021. Very exciting.
Thank you.
Yes, COVID-19 is a geopolitical game changer. We are still in the midst of it. COVID-19 isn't in the rearview mirror yet. One thing that we are seeing in terms of how geopolitics and how global commerce is being affected by COVID-19 is the disruption of supply chains. And it's being seen in many forms. Large brands from all over the world are seeing the risks in having large portions of their supply chains in countries with weak rule of law, countries where public health statistics can't be trusted. And one effect of all this, one effect of the breakdown of supply chains and the reorientation of supply chains is that the world is going to become a much more competitive place. Countries such as Bangladesh that might have been shut out of subcontracting opportunities, supply chain opportunities to the large brands who by and large had huge portions of their supply chains locked up in China. The country will become, the global marketplace will become much more competitive, I think, as a result of COVID-19. And a well-placed, growing emerging market economy like Bangladesh, again, could be well-placed to benefit from some of these global trends. That being said, COVID-19 isn't in the rearview mirror yet. We're not yet sure how the domestic politics, country by country, will be affected by COVID-19. In the United States, the domestic politics surrounding COVID still aren't settled. It's very messy. So a lot of factors still need to be played out to see what the new normal will be in terms of geopolitics. But the breakdown of supply chains and the reorientation of global commerce is one effect that we're already seeing as a result of COVID.
John, how do you see the US-China rivalry and geopolitics after the COVID-19?
COVID-19 has made the US-China relationship even more problematic. The relationship was tense prior to COVID-19. It's been tense for years. COVID-19 has simply added an element of tension, and there's an accusatory nature now going back and forth between the two countries, exemplified by the hostile meeting between the United States Secretary of State Blinken and his counterpart from China in their meeting just a couple months ago in Alaska. But whether you're talking about trade or Taiwan, relations with North Korea, COVID-19 has simply made the US-China relationship even more tense. And one concern about the whole world knows where COVID-19 came from. Whether it came from a lab or it came from nature, we may learn that sometime, hopefully soon. But ultimately, the whole world knows where COVID-19 came from. this isn't to cast aspersions. It's more what China did in the aftermath of the outbreak, once it was out, once the whole world had it. The instinct of some authoritarian governments, and China's not the only one, but the instinct of some authoritarian governments to cover it up, to deny it happened. This isn't the first time the government of China has reacted this way to a crisis. Earthquakes, labor unrest. The reaction of the CCP and the Xi Jinping government is to cover it up. And when you're dealing with a public health crisis, when you're dealing with a pathogen that's in the environment, it's out, people are catching it, that is not the time to put your head in the sand and try to make the world believe nothing is happening. So the instinct, again, it's not just China, and I'm not saying this to cast aspersions, but the instinct of authoritarian governments to deny, to cover it up, to lie, is problematic on the best of days. But when you're dealing with an ongoing public health crisis, which is still ongoing, as I mentioned, COVID-19 is not in the rearview mirror yet. It makes an already problematic situation much, much harder to solve.
Thank you, John. I'll come to you again. Dr. Parvez Imdad, is the pandemic reshaping geopolitics?
Thank you, Mr. Zillur Rahman. It's my pleasure to be in this program. And first, I'd like to express my deep appreciation to you for the very detailed, elaborate, and analytical programs that you have conducted throughout the COVID crisis and even till now, which has been very informative and useful. And I'd also like to express my pleasure and to be here with Mr. John Morrell. And I fully agree with him. It's very useful and insightful comments. I do agree fully. From my side, I'd like to relate this first, that what is important at this stage is to address the governance-related issues that have triggered off the intensity and magnitude of COVID. Basically, apart from the health issues, the health-related problems and concerns, that reflects the weaknesses, the inadequacies in the health sector, internationally and nationally. For I would rather link it to some sort of severe governance inadequacies. But related to these are the information gap on the requirements of the health sector, the inability of the international health mechanism and the national health mechanisms to derive knowledge and experiences from the past epidemics, if not full pandemics, inadequate dissemination of information and knowledge, and inefficient coordination, or I would say insufficient coordination between the international health mechanism like the World Health Organization and the national health systems. Another thing I'd like to focus from the governance side is this is very important to identify the origin of the problem. And if the reason is not identified, it would lead to lack of transparency and lack of adequate disclosure. There is need for proper investigation to find out why it happened so that the world could be prepared for the future. The other point I'd like to make is that WHO, they have done a lot of good work, but I think the UN, under the guidance of the UN, there's a need for a paradigm shift in the focus of the UN on the health sector for a better tomorrow. And I think WHO may have to consider structural operational adjustments and improvements to address similar issues. I hope not that this will not happen again because the world has been badly shaken by this. But there is need to learn how can we do things better. At the moment, on the governance side, I'd like to focus on the need for equity and fairness in vaccine distribution, especially for developing countries. And I appreciate that many of the developed countries are really trying to help, and the international system is also trying to see this as a wake-up call and they're working on it, but there are constraints and limitations. But there is need to ensure access and distribution so that countries in need can get the vaccine as soon as possible.
Dr. Parvez Imdad, can this pandemic stunt geopolitics?
Yes, I agree with Mr. John Morrell. I fully agree with him. I don't want to repeat, I do agree. But at the same time, I would say more than geopolitics, what we should focus now are the governance and the management issues related to this. It is better now to see how best we can address and minimize the trauma, the severe, sort of challenge to economic and social development, the challenges to globalization, and my deep concern that this might pose as more severe challenges to poverty, unemployment, and inequality in the medium term. And the free market has to work further intensively to address these issues. Lastly, I would like to say that if these issues, the governance side, are not duly addressed and given priority at this stage, then the pandemic, despite improvements on the health side, the pandemic impact may continue for a longer period, and that would not be very favorable for the interest of the international community.
Mr. John Morrell, can you visualize the future of for security NATO, Quad, Indo-Pacific strategy, and BRI, Belt and Road Initiative?
The future of the Indo-Pacific region, if it is to be a healthy and positive future, nobody ultimately can read the future. If I could, I wouldn't be talking to you. I'd be living on an island somewhere counting my gold. But if it is to be a positive future in the broader Indo-Pacific region, it needs to consist of 4 Ds. The letter D, D is in David, the 4 Ds. The first is defense, obviously, but then diplomacy, development, and democracy. If Bangladesh is to capitalize on some of the supply chain opportunities that Bangladeshi firms and manufacturers will be getting access to in the coming months and years, having freedom of navigation and maritime security is critical. And that is ultimately what the Quad is focused on. There's a lot of misconceptions about the Quad. The United States, India, Australia, and Japan. The Quad is not an Asian NATO. This is not a mutual defense pact or anything like that. It is a voluntary coalition of 4 of the world's leading democracies to stand up for and to ensure maritime security. Bangladesh, much of the economic success that Bangladesh has been and is enjoying is due to the government's success at promoting exports. That means Bangladeshi goods have to get onto a boat, and that boat has to be able to take Bangladeshi goods to other markets. Maritime security is critical for the future, not just the Bangladeshi economy, but of the Indo-Pacific Rim economies in general. And the data, the historical data is overwhelmingly clear. With democracy, with sustainable and inclusive economic development comes stability, geopolitical stability, regional stability. It is, after all, you open the show Zillur with a quote from The Art of War, Sun Tzu. Another quote by Winston Churchill, who said that market-oriented democracy is the worst form of government imaginable, except for every other form of government that's been tried. And so these 4 Ds, of course, defense is going to be a part of it. We're dealing with major military powers in this part of the world. But diplomacy, development, and democracy are just as critical, if not more so, to a prosperous and stable Indo-Pacific region where freedom of navigation and maritime security are ensured.
John, the term vaccine diplomacy is being used widely in the media and discussions about the global distribution of various COVID-19 vaccinations. One also hears commonly about vaccine nationalism. Is vaccine diplomacy meaningfully different from earlier practices of states to link foreign aid and loans to their diplomatic goals?
In concept, no. The notion of tied aid. donors have been doing this since there have been donors. From the United States. When the United States provides food aid, they provide corn grown in Iowa and soybeans grown in Missouri. The notion of tied aid is a part of the donor community. Vaccine diplomacy in concept would be very similar. What makes this issue different, however, is that when it comes to COVID, ultimately, it's not going to be over for any of us until it's truly over for all of us. The longer COVID is in the ecosystem, the higher the chance for these variants, the South Africa strain, the UK strain. Within the United States, now there's the Florida strain and the Dakotas strain. The longer COVID is in the ecosystem, the higher the likelihood, the higher the risk that one of these strains proves resistant to the vaccine. So when it comes to COVID, it's not over for any of us until it's over for all of us. And for those countries, my colleague, Dr. Imdad mentioned, and it's not just the United States and the United Kingdom, countries that are doing well with vaccine rollouts. It is in the interest of the United States, of the United Kingdom, of China, to be as generous, probably isn't even the right word, to be as strategic as possible with making vaccines as widely available as possible globally so that we can finally put COVID in the rearview mirror. And again, this I mentioned earlier, I'm not trying to cast aspersions on any other country. China, just recently, just within the last few days, announced a very large shipment of vaccines to Nepal, a country that's really going through a hard time right now. And so, again, it's not going to be over for any of us until it's over for all of us. Vaccine diplomacy is going to be critical over the coming year to 2 years. The better it goes, the sooner we can wrap this up, the sooner life can return to some semblance of normality.
Dr. Parvez, there is a discussion going on that how USA, China, and India have taken the lead in delivering COVID-19 vaccines to lower middle income countries, particularly in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Africa. Do you think these gifts come with strings attached for the recipient countries in geopolitical and or economic terms?
Just in addition to what Mr. John Morrell has just now said, I'd just like to add here that the main challenges before the international community, and especially before the developing countries now, would be food security. I'd rather identify food security and trade deficit as the two core priorities that the developed countries and the international development institutions may like to focus on in the medium term, if not the long term. And I, as in one of my papers, I've written that it would be useful for the UN to have a convention on food security and prevention of hunger, in line with the World Food Programme's pillars of recovery from COVID that they have, for which they have been awarded last year's their actions on COVID, and for which they have received international recognition. The term related to food security challenge and trade deficit. Another emerging challenge is the new poor in many of the developing countries. And to that would be, of course, is related unemployment, loss of business, loss of SMEs, small and medium enterprises, and of course, erosion of short-term employment possibilities. Now, in terms of the international development cooperation, I feel there could be more focus on concessional aid in the medium term to the long term. And regional cooperation has mainly been political, but that's fine. But there could be economic dimensions of regional cooperation could also be geared up to deliver some results in terms of knowledge, experiences to be shared by countries within respective regions to face such challenges. I'd just like to thank Mr. John Morrell for a very important observation. In fact, I do agree with all his points on maritime security is very extremely important. You know, maritime security and maritime collaboration is a new dimension that could add a sort of a new focus on future collaboration between countries. Not much had been done on that, but of course I think it's quite a challenge because maritime security issues differ from region to region. But this would be an important element in the context of expanded international development cooperation. Finally, I'd like to suggest that there could be a structural and functional change in the whole focus of international development cooperation. And Bangladesh has done very well, have moved to higher per capita income. Now, to move forward for Bangladesh and other developing countries, there is need for the international development organizations to have more intensive dialogue on a demand-based and result-based focus to get over the challenges of COVID and enable these countries to move ahead towards development. Thank you.
John, would you like to add anything here?
No, Dr. Imdad made some excellent points about how vaccine diplomacy, food security, these are interrelated issues. But again, the thing I think that does set apart the provision of vaccines from the provision of food aid or the provision of donor assistance to build schools and build roads, donor projects to improve the quality of governance. These are investments that donors make with an intended longer term horizon. It's a return on investment that will take several years to be realized. COVID is an acute crisis. Again, I've said, I apologize for repeating myself. COVID's not in the rearview mirror yet. We're still in the midst of it. It's shifting around the globe. It was Western Europe and the United States that were hit terribly hard last year. South Asia is struggling very bad right now. There is light at the end of the tunnel. There is reason for optimism, but we are still in the thick of this. Vaccines have to be made as widely available as possible. Because again, this won't truly be over for any of us until it's over for all of us. Making vaccines available is really the only way it ever will be over for all of us.
John, Dr. Parvez Imdad was talking about governance. So in your view, what are the challenges for good governance across the world, and what is the international perception about these on Bangladesh?
The perception of Bangladesh, again, I'll speak as a foreigner, as an outsider. The perception of Bangladesh in Western media in the United States, there are really two dominant themes. Again, in terms of perception, the economy of Bangladesh is booming. That's widely known. Some remarkable developments, actually, just in the last few months. The first quarter of this year, GDP per capita, gross domestic product per capita of Bangladesh, is now greater than that of Pakistan or India. So on a per person basis, Bangladesh is wealthier now than India or Pakistan. Another remarkable development in terms of the economy of Bangladesh, the United States Chamber of Commerce, by far the largest business organization on earth, has just recently, just earlier this year, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce created the United States Bangladesh Business Council, which it wouldn't have done unless there was a critical mass of American businesses, of American companies, wanting to work in Bangladesh. So the economy of Bangladesh is booming, and the government of Bangladesh deserves a lot of credit. The government of Bangladesh has done a very good job with fiscal policy, fiscal discipline. As an American, I can say we almost look with envy at the debt load of Bangladesh, how small it is relative to many of Bangladesh's neighbors, and relative to the United States and many countries around the world. So the government of Bangladesh does deserve legitimate credit for the work it's done on stabilizing, modernizing, and growing the economy. The second aspect of Bangladesh's emerging brand, if you want to call it that, is that while the economy is moving in the right direction, the country seems to be moving in the wrong direction in terms of democracy and human rights. There are views of the Bangladeshi Anti-Corruption Commission, which was established about a decade and a half ago with much fanfare. It was thought to be a potential game changer. Now there's a view that the ACC is badly politicized, and it's a weapon to go after political opponents. The Digital Security Act of 2018. Again, I'm not trying to cast aspersions, and I say this with all humility. I am an outsider. I'm a foreigner. I have lived in Bangladesh before, but it was a long time ago. The economy is booming, but it's moving in the wrong direction in terms of democracy and human rights. And in terms of the governance challenges, your viewers might be interested in a publication that was produced by the World Economic Forum. It's an annual index. That's not only an index, it's an annual survey of major markets to identify the main obstacles to business. It's called the Global Competitiveness Index. And of the surveyed companies operating in Bangladesh, the top 3 most problematic factors for doing business in Bangladesh are: first is corruption, second is poor infrastructure, and the third is inefficient government bureaucracy. So that means the top 3 challenges to doing business in Bangladesh are all directly related to governance issues: corruption, infrastructure investment, reforming the bureaucracy. These are governance issues. And so while Bangladesh is enjoying a lot of economic success right now, I mentioned earlier that the data is overwhelming, that long-term stability, long-term and sustainable economic development cannot happen separate from democratic governance and respect for human rights. Even in countries that don't conduct elections, democracy is more than just elections. How a government governs in between elections is just as significant to the health of democracy, to the long-term viability of democracy. And so while Bangladesh is enjoying a lot of success in some areas right now, other areas, and I'm speaking only in terms of the international perception of Bangladesh, other areas, hopefully Bangladesh can see some improvement. My organization, the Center for International Private Enterprise, we have projects in Bangladesh trying to help address some of these issues, because Bangladesh is a country on the rise. It would be a shame to see some of the remarkable improvements Bangladesh has seen derailed by growing frustrations with crackdowns on human rights and movements away from democracy.
So, John, what would you say are the most common governance risks that countries like Bangladesh must address?
That's an excellent question. Right now, again, everything right now is dominated by COVID. What is the priority number 1 right now of the government of Bangladesh, the government of Nepal, the government of India, the government of the United States, the Biden administration? The number 1 priority everywhere is COVID. How do we finally whip this thing so we can put it behind us and we can begin to rebuild and build back better? One of the longer term governance challenges that Bangladesh is going to face, and emerging markets all over the world need to find a way to address, especially against the backdrop of the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, out of China, the need for government transparency and accountability. BRI has had many positive effects, and it could be a game changer in a positive way for the developing countries all across the world. But some of the problems, some of the problematic attributes of BRI largely preclude BRI from having the positive impact that it could have. One of the biggest and most problematic aspects of China's BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, is secrecy. Even if BRI isn't trying to cover up malfeasance, oftentimes it looks like it is because of the secrecy. The Belt and Road Initiative is largely a loan portfolio. China loans money to emerging market governments. and they use that money to construct public works. So there's more to it than that, but the largest component of BRI are loans, state-driven loans, provided either directly by the government of China or by government-owned banks out of China. When a government borrows money from China, a common clause in the credit facility documents are non-disclosure commitments. If you borrow money from China, you are obligated, according to the terms of the loan, to never disclose the terms of the loan. Now, again, democracy is more than elections. A democratic government, a government that considers itself democratic, simply cannot borrow money on secret terms from secret sources for secret purposes and still consider itself to be a democracy. The public frustrations that are being engendered by the secrecy surrounding money from China flowing into emerging markets, it's engendering a growing chorus of frustration. So for a government like Bangladesh that does a lot of business with China and undoubtedly will do even more business with China in the future, Bangladesh has to find a way to uphold at least a baseline level of government transparency and accountability, because the more business a government does with China, the more pressure there is to reduce government transparency and accountability, which of course is completely antithetical to democratic governance.
Dr. Parvez Imdad, any remarks?
No, I'd just like to mention here that since the budget have just been presented before the Parliament, I'd just like to make a few observations on the economic trends, as also highlighted in the budget. On the positive side, this has been a pro-business, pro-private sector, and supportive to sustain and inclusive growth. Secondly, this budget recognizes the need for interventions to effectively combat COVID-19. And I do feel that the budget gives significant linkages to the past year's budget in terms of the support needed to effectively meet the impact of COVID-19. There is need, of course, also to look at the safety nets on a more comprehensive term, to see this as broader welfare nets. And allocation priorities, I think it's 1 year's allocation may have a different context next year, but the government, of course, would have the justification to justify allocation priorities, but it doesn't mean that one sector is given more importance than the other. So I leave it to the government to decide the priorities, but at the same time to ensure that the emerging needs of the economy are firmly met. Thirdly, the third point I'd like to focus is on efficient utilization of resources, which the government is trying to do so. And the annual development program, this needs to be effectively implemented. As I have also mentioned in one of my previous discussions, I would like to focus on budgets, the performance-based and results-based emphasis. And that would also lead to address emerging issues like new poor, or even managing budget deficits, and also making the allocations more effectively utilized. In terms of the transparency side, I'd like to mention that the parliamentary standing committees are doing fairly well. However, there is need for further citizens' engagement. I would recommend citizens' advisory committees or experts' advisory committees for the ministries, so that the sector focus, the relevance and importance of the programs could be better evaluated, and the citizens could have a direct role in advising the ministries and the government agencies concerned. And in terms of the other areas, there is need to focus on entrepreneurship development. Creating new jobs would remain a challenge, and it is for the private sector to come up more intensively with the job creation exercise. And Bangladesh, I'm sure, would continue to focus on doing better in terms of the ease of doing business and the global competitive index. There is
Mr. Parvez Imdad, what are the biggest challenges on the horizon for Bangladesh in terms of combating corruption?
Well, there is need to make things, first of all, I would say, if decentralization takes place more effectively, that's one way to reduce corruption. And number two is accountability in terms of visible accountability, that you will have provisions for incentives for the good performers and penalties, quick penalties and effective penalties for those engaged in corruption. So there should be a more visible actions in this regard, and I'm sure that the government is working on it. But in terms of what I would say, that other point that is
And
important
one more thing, Dr. Parvez Imdad, the corruption in the health sector has been the main talking points this year and last year for obvious reasons. So does it mean other sectors have been less affected?
Yes, you see, health sector is a very important sector, and this COVID experience has shown us that you see health, all the sectors of development are closely linked to each other. As compared to 40, 50 years ago, when sectors could be seen in separate compartments, there's now a very intensive interdependency of sectors to one another. So if there is corruption in one area of development, it certainly leads to the misallocation or misuse of resources and inefficient utilization of resources in another sector. So when we talk of improving governance, when we talk of enhanced accountability and transparency, accounts visibility in terms of effective implementation of the government's policies and programs, there is a total reflection on the overall, on all the segments of the economy. So when you talk of the health sector, there is certainly need for improvement, and that improvement will have a very significant impact on the overall performance of the economy. As we were talking a short while ago, that Bangladesh is doing better as compared to many of its neighbors and is moving ahead in terms of GDP and growth rate and managing inflation, controlling budget deficits. So there is, you see, further improvement in governance and managerial efficiency will spur growth, will lead to further success in our inclusive growth. That's the point I'm trying to make, that governance carries significant relevance and importance in promoting growth.
John Morrell, what questions should we be asking about corruption that we are not? And how would you describe the nature of corruption in Bangladesh? Is there anything distinctive about it compared to other countries?
One of the questions that people should be asking about corruption in Bangladesh relates to government budgets. My colleague, Dr. Imdad, one of his specialties is fiscal policies and public budgeting. I mentioned before the need for transparency and accountability in government. There are few ways more effective at ensuring transparency and accountability in governance than transparency of budgets. Knowing how your government is spending money transforms citizens from passive consumers of government services to actually it allows them to be able to participate in how to prioritize and define what services are most needed. If citizens and businesses, entrepreneurs don't know how their government is spending money, if they don't know how their tax dollars are being used, if they don't know what public investments are being prioritized, if they don't know how much that airport actually cost, how much was it supposed to cost, where did the cost overruns go? Dr. Imdad made an excellent point about how crucial budget transparency is to the fight against corruption. And I mentioned that the impact that the Belt and Road Initiative is having on transparency and accountability of governance. Largely, it's because of inadequate budgeting. So much of the money that comes into Bangladesh from China, and that's not unique to Bangladesh. When money comes from China into emerging markets, that money largely stays off budget. It is never reflected in any capital or recurring budgets in the countries that receive it. That means it's not subject to parliamentary review. It's not subject to citizen comment periods. It's not subject to right to information requests, because this information was never actually recorded in Bangladesh's official budgets. So transparency in budgeting, accountability in terms of public finances and public financial management is critical to the fight against corruption. That's not the only thing that should be asked, of course. Another question that people and businesses in Bangladesh should be asking about the fight against corruption is, how can the private sector be mobilized to be a force for positive change? There's a prevailing view. Again, I'm not trying to cast aspersions against my fellow NGO workers. There's a natural bias, I think, amongst a lot of NGOs that, businesses in the private sector are part of the problem when it comes to corruption. It's businesses that want to pay bribes because it allows them to not pay taxes and pollute the environment and all that stuff. Well, the evidence shows that not only is that not true, the exact opposite is true. Corruption functions effectively from an economic standpoint. It functions like a tax. It is a mandatory expense that citizens and businesses face. But unlike a tax, it's unofficial. You don't get a receipt. If you pay a bribe, you don't get a receipt. There's no proof. If the person you bribed doesn't live up to his end of the bargain and he stiffs you, what are you going to do? Take him to court? Out him in the media? You paid him a bribe. You're just as culpable as he is. So it's a tax. It's an unenforceable informal contract that is a massive deterrent to investment. And so the business community, the private sector, can be a very influential contributor in the fight against corruption if they're mobilized and if a proper framework can be put into place that gives businesses an incentive to act. Because you asked me before, Zillur, about the global, or at least the Western perception of Bangladesh. Again, the economy of Bangladesh is booming. It's now wealthier than many of your neighbors, including in India and Pakistan. The issue of corruption is hugely detrimental to the brand of Bangladesh around the world. The Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index. Bangladesh has been ranked about 145, so the 145th country in the world, with the first being the least corrupt and the last, the 180th being the most corrupt. Bangladesh has been ranked about 145 for about 15 straight years. But in the early days of the index, there were only 145 countries surveyed. So for about 4 straight years, 10 years ago, Bangladesh was the worst ranked country in terms of the CPI on earth, meaning that in the eyes of Transparency International, which is a well-respected, the CPI is a well-respected product around the world. Bangladesh was the most corrupt country on earth, according to the CPI. Now the CPI index has grown, so more countries are being added to it that 10 years ago weren't included. Countries like North Korea, Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq. These countries weren't included in earlier versions of the CPI. So those countries are now ranked lower than Bangladesh. But Bangladesh is ranked right about 145 for 15 straight years. The issue of corruption in Bangladesh, it's enormously detrimental to the brand of Bangladesh around the world. And I mentioned before the barriers to doing business. When businesses, both Bangladeshi and multinational, when they were surveyed, what are the paramount obstacles to doing business in Bangladesh? Corruption was number one. Corruption has been the number one barrier to doing business in Bangladesh for as long as the survey has been conducted. And so corruption, one final point I'll make about corruption in Bangladesh, and it's a critical point. I probably shouldn't have saved it for last. Corruption is not a cultural issue. A lot of emerging markets all over the world, not just in South Asia, but all over the world, oftentimes corruption it's waved away as it's just inherent in our culture. It's why it's so embedded. It's why we can't get rid of it. Corruption is not a cultural phenomenon. Some of the most corrupt countries on earth are in Europe, they're in Asia, they're in Africa, they're in Latin America. people of all skin colors, all faiths, all forms of government. Corruption is not cultural. Corruption can be addressed. One of the benefits of mobilizing the business community in the fight against corruption is that it can change public perceptions of corruption. One of the most critical benchmarks that Bangladesh could make in the fight against corruption is to change the public perception that, right now there's a prevailing view in Bangladesh that corruption's terrible. It's always been here. It always will be here. It's unavoidable. Everyone does it. How do we change that prevailing view to a prevailing view of, corruption is bad, but progress is possible. We can win in this fight. It's not hopeless. We're not passive vassals in this phenomenon. Progress is possible. If the business community can be brought on board, it can help drive that message home.
John, here is another issue. How pandemic impacts women empowerment across the globe?
That is a fantastic question, Zillur. I'll answer it. I'll just share a story from my home, the United States. Women have, by huge margins, have disproportionately borne the economic cost of the pandemic. Business closures, the reasons as to why that is are multifaceted and complex, but the outcome is clear. Women were far more likely to lose their jobs than men. Women were far less likely to be rehired. Women statistically lost a far larger percentage of their income, of their wealth, than did men. And that's in the United States, the leading, wealthiest economy on earth. This is a global phenomenon. The economic cost of COVID is disproportionately borne by women. It's not an easy, it's not a simple explanation as to why that's the case. And it's not going to be a simple fix, but reemerging economically, politically from COVID. I used the term before, it's a slogan of the Biden administration, Build Back Better. I wasn't trying to make a partisan plug. But COVID does provide an opportunity to reassess some fiscal policies, to reassess some public investments. Investing in the economic empowerment of women is going to be critical to a healthy and sustainable and inclusive recovery from COVID.
Mr. Mohammed Parvez Imdad, any comments?
Yes, I do feel that COVID has badly rocked all segments of development, including women's empowerment issues. So there is need to focus especially on women's issues, women development related issues, and to see that women's rights and interests, economic interests, social interests are duly protected and carried forward. I'd just like to add a few observations that the Prime Minister of Bangladesh is strongly committed to eradicating corruption. And she has announced repeatedly, she has mentioned of zero tolerance against corruption. And also in Bangladesh, the citizens, by and large, the civil society, a huge segment of civil society, citizens, intelligentsia, and Mr. Zillur Rahman, yourself, for example, have always been vocal against corruption. So there is a growing consensus. While I do appreciate the concern that corruption should be minimized, of course, but it's one on the hopeful side is that in Bangladesh there is a growing feeling, awareness, understanding of all people to check corruption. And that is what is very hopeful and significant that this will be achieved. The other point I'm trying to make is that PPPs, public-private partnerships. So the private sector, I agree with Mr. John Morrell on the very important role of the private sector, that they need to come forward in a more specific role of supporting the programs for poverty reduction, in addition to income and employment generation. And PPP's public-private partnership, which was basically a focus on the infrastructure side, should now come more on the social sector side, on the health side and other related issues. The automation, the digital approach in Bangladesh could also be further expanded to easing business processes and also the official functioning and other processes could be simplified that will make things more accountable and more transparent. There is need to ensure that the capital is reached to those who lost their jobs, those who are in need of employment following COVID, and microfinance need to be effectively coordinated between the government and the NGOs who are working on it. Financial sector improvement is something that would also need to look at the flow of resources from the country, and this is something that is also being discussed now. On FDI, yes, there is need for to look at FDI with more intensive focus, both on foreign and local investments. And I believe that the Bangladesh missions are doing a good job abroad on economic diplomacy, and they have more intensive plans to work on that. Having said that, this COVID challenge has been very serious for the whole world, and I would like to focus on special attention by the UN agencies and the international development organizations to work closely, more closely with the developing countries with renewed focus, especially on the areas that warrant immediate attention, that's availability of resources and also more of concessional resources. And that would also lead to technical assistance in improving skills and capacities and enhancing competitiveness.
John, as you know, Bangladesh is a role model for microfinance. How would you define microfinance, and what distinguishes microfinance from mainstream finance?
Bangladesh is indeed a role model for microfinance. Bangladesh was basically the birthplace of microfinance. When Dr. Yunus and the Grameen Bank first came up with the concept, I forget what it was, 20 years ago, somewhere around there. Microfinance was basically just microcredit, the extension of micro loans to micro entrepreneurs. Microfinance has since broadened and diversified remarkably in that now microfinance, again, the term microfinance, what it means now, it's not just limited to microcredit. It now basically means the extension of commercial and banking services to micro entrepreneurs. One of the innovations that the Grameen Bank came up with many years after it invented the concept is the idea of, instead of giving cash loans to a small farmer or someone who owns a small shop, instead of giving them cash, because the data shows that the vast majority of micro loans go to inventory replenishment. I take a loan from you and I buy more stuff to sell. That's necessary, obviously, but it doesn't fully change the productive potential of an enterprise. The Grameen Bank, again, many years ago, but it's much more recent than the birth of microfinance, but the Grameen Bank came up with an innovation. How can we give loans in the form of capital equipment? So instead of giving 20 entrepreneurs in one village 20 different loans, let's give the village a tractor. Let's give the village a well with some sort of a water purification equipment. Again, reducing waterborne illnesses, increasing agricultural load potential. These are investments, they're loans, but they're loans in the form of capital, not loans in the form of cash. And so that innovation is one of the many contributions Bangladesh has made to the development space. And the birthplace of microfinance is something that Bangladesh is and should be very proud of.
Dr. Parvez, very briefly, what is the nexus between microfinance and sustainable development?
You see, microfinance basically stems from the idea of making capital accessible to those who are in need of capital. But I think now the way we look at microfinance could be seen in a more broader context now. Microfinance is not only aimed to alleviate poverty and improving living standards and quality of life. There could be an added focus on microfinance to extend support to SMEs, promotion of small business, and even entrepreneurship development in smaller forms. So there's an integrated approach to look at how microfinance could be more effective to meet the current challenges on social and economic development. And I think in microfinance, there is need to have a closer coordination between what the non-government and non-state actors and agencies are doing and what the government is doing. Now, these gaps need to be addressed to make it more results-oriented. So a performance-based, result-oriented focus on microfinance would lead to achieving results in a more appropriate, in a more, sort of definite way. At the moment, there are, of course, different results of the studies and the research done on how microfinance have been able to achieve its objectives and what are the deficiencies. So I would rather say that there could be more intensive performance-based, result-based focus with institutional alignment and coordination, better coordination between the government focus on microfinance and what the NGOs are doing. In short, I'd like to say that.
Indeed, it's a fascinating discussion, Mr. John Morrell and Dr. Mohammad Parvez Imdad. Thanks for joining us. The novel coronavirus pandemic can be the moment the world pushes back against fear and isolationism and turns instead towards hope, solidarity, and a shared sense of global community. People seek out a light at the end of the tunnel and work to show to each other that we all stand together. Moreover, responding to the pandemic is not just about rectifying long-standing crises, but also about building a resilient world in the interest of everyone. Thank you and goodbye.